I am Peter Lee for Newsbud's China Watch. In this special July 4th weekend edition of China Watch, sabotaging Korean peace, it's as American as apple pie. Recently, the Asian punditsphere was abuzz with excited comments on an ABC News report. North Korea has increased nuclear production at secret sites, say U.S. officials. As to the assertion that North Korea is cranking out fissile material at one or two secret processing facilities, so what? Kim Jong-un said he'd stop missile and nuclear tests, but never said he'd stop processing. The story wasn't too earth-shattering. The assessments are probably based on intel predating the Singapore meeting anyway, and for that matter, apparently it was already common knowledge in the IC community that the DPRK had some enrichment hidey holes other than the publicly revealed facility at Yongbyon. In practical terms, this story appears to be an effort to make a Korea deal and the lifting of sanctions against North Korea impossible by establishing the "these guys are liars and can't be trusted ever" frame. So, if it looks like Kim Jong-un is making too much headway in negotiations, I expect some more damaging, awkward, or maybe just forged intel nuggets will be fed into the public discourse to support escalated and increasingly adversarial demands for data, inspection, and concessions, and to make sure that the timetable for a peace deal and the lifting of sanctions disappear far, far into the unforeseeable future. Happened with Iraq, happened with Iran, happens all the time. Anybody remember the laptop of death? The drive filled with sketch and rather useless intel about Iranian nuclear activities that was dumped over the IAEA transom in order to kneecap the negotiations between Iran and the J5 in 2011? What brought joy and encouragement to the enemies of Trump's approach to North Korea is that the ABC story declared that it was heavily sourced out of the U.S. intelligence community, as in 5 officials say, and analysts at the CIA and other intelligence agencies don't see it that way, according to a dozen officials who are familiar with their assessments and spoke on condition of anonymity. So, via the ABC article, outside critics of the negotiations now have insider skinny to guide and buttress their criticisms of the secret negotiation process. Interesting question is, how do a dozen government officials simultaneously decide to divulge classified assessments? Did a North Korea hawk bureaucrat in the intelligence community give the green light? Doesn't seem likely, given the multiple agencies involved. Was it John Bolton, who is the ultimate Korea regime change hawk and also a famously aggressive manipulator of press coverage and somebody who gets to see all the classified goodies from his post at the National Security Council? Or was it even Trump himself, playing good cop in public while leaks from the IC community increase his negotiation leverage over Kim Jong-un and also gets the hardliner critics off of Trump's back? All we know for sure is that the leak had the CIA stamp of approval, because one of the co-authors, Ken Delanian, is notorious as the CIA mop-up man who coordinates his coverage with the powers that be at Langley. Literally! As in this Intercept expose, the CIA's mop-up man, LA Times reporter cleared stories with agency before publication. Back in 2014, the Intercept's revelation was enough to earn Delanian criticism from his erstwhile employer, the LA Times. But today, serving as the intelligence community's Infowar asset and conduit for tittle-tattle is apparently a badge of honor.
ABC News intelligence and national security reporter Ken Delanian. And Ken, I know you've been working on some of that. We have with them.
Anyway, this would not be the first time interested parties reached out, as we say, to sabotage Korean peace negotiations. It would not even be the second time. It's at least the third time. The first instance of sabotage of Korean peace negotiations was conducted by General Douglas MacArthur during the Korean War. MacArthur tried to preempt a peace initiative coordinated by President Truman by issuing a demand that the Chinese and North Koreans surrender instead of trying to negotiate. Then MacArthur sent a naval task force down to the Taiwan Strait to provoke an incident with the People's Republic of China that would allow him to expand the war instead of ending it. This virtually unknown chapter of history is described in the exclusive Newsbud DVD and video offering, General Douglas MacArthur's Conspiracy to Start a War with the People's Republic of China. A link to purchase is in the show notes. Another, more recent sabotage of a Korea peace process is described in the following video report: how a U.S. fiasco in Macau birthed North Korea's atomic bomb. This suppressed story of a botched covert financial sanctions and regime change campaign executed by North Korea hardliners during the George W. Bush administration is important because it put North Korea and the People's Republic of China on notice. On notice, not just that U.S. hardliners will take any and every opportunity to make things difficult for North Korea and China, no matter what stated policy or how negotiations are going. It also revealed to China the existential threat posed by U.S. secondary sanctions on the PRC's financial system, and it has driven a decade-long effort by China to neutralize those sanctions by establishment of a parallel international financial order based on the RMB currency. The success of the PRC's efforts may be measured sooner rather than later. One of the premier advocates for secondary financial sanctions against China and the DPRK, Anthony Ruggiero.
Let's bring in North Korea expert and Foundation for Defense of Democracy's senior fellow, Anthony Ruggiero. Anthony
Ruggiero has joined John Bolton's National Security Council as its new North Korea director. In Politico last year, Ruggiero had this to say in an article titled "Failure to Sanction China Helped North Korea," formal officials say. "We cannot be serious about North Korea's sanctions until we're ready to confront the China challenge," said Anthony Ruggiero, a veteran U.S. intelligence and financial counterproliferation official until December. "The big question is whether there is political will." I get it that you don't want to sanction the Chinese entities the day before Xi walks into Mar-a-Lago, but what about the week after? Together with the ABC piece, Ruggiero's appointment is another indication that rhetoric and probably action on North Korea and China are going to escalate. Buckle your seatbelts and enjoy my report on the catastrophic cascade of first and second order consequences that followed America's first disastrous adventure in financial sanctions targeting China and North Korea, the Banco Delta Asia fiasco of 2005. Hi, I'm Peter Lee, and this is Newsbud's Asia Brief, where we explore the tangled history and crucial backstory needed to understand Asian affairs. On this episode of Asia Brief, I dig into one of the least known but most significant episodes in U.S.-North Korean relations, the Banco Delta Asia fiasco. It's titled, "How a U.S. Fiasco in Macau Birthed North Korea's Atomic Bomb." There's a fundamental contradiction at the heart of U.S.-North Korea policy. The United States wants to sanction North Korea, but we don't do any business with North Korea, so there's nothing to sanction. Directly, anyway. The solution to this problem is to sanction the people who do business with North Korea and hurt North Korea indirectly. This is called secondary sanctions, and it means sanctioning North Korea's primary trading partner, China. As I discussed in my May 3rd, 2017 China Watch broadcast, Rex Tillerson flashed the secondary sanctions card to China while urging it to do more to bring North Korea to negotiations. Nowadays, secondary sanctions are a matter of U.S. law and legislation, and they are deployed very, very carefully. But When the George W. Bush administration first road-tested secondary sanctions in 2006, they were, like much of Bush policy, crude, stupid, and unilateral, and counterproductive. Disastrously counterproductive. In 2006, neoconservative anti-North Korea hawks decided they would disrupt North Korea's international financial dealings by targeting a tiny bank in the Chinese enclave of Macau, Banco Delta Asia, often known by its initials as BDA. BDA handled some North Korean transactions and held about $25 million in North Korea-linked deposits. But it mainly operated inside Macau, and it was decided that destroying BDA would be a good way to test the U.S. financial warfare weapon with minimal collateral damage. U.S. Treasury Department strategists employed a provision of the Patriot Act, Section 311, that allowed the Treasury Department to cut off banks suspected of money laundering from the U.S. financial system as an internal administrative measure. In other words, Patriot Act 311 was unilateral, untransparent, arbitrary, and because the criterion for the cutoff was suspicion, not proof, you didn't even need any evidence. Perfect, in other words, to the neocon mind, which abhorred the idea that U.S. power might be restrained by rules, laws, consultation, or ideas of equity and due process. Boom! In September 2005, Treasury designated Banco Delta Asia as a bank of money laundering concern because it was allegedly passing North Korean counterfeit notes into the international financial system. Sure enough, BDA lost all its banking relationships, there was a run on the bank, and it went into receivership. The North Korean accounts in BDA were frozen. But then the problems began. North Korea withdrew from ongoing negotiations with the United States over the agreed framework for denuclearization. This was probably okay with the neocons. After all, they wanted to sabotage the agreed framework and roll out a regime change policy instead, and the BDA designation was probably a good way to get the ball rolling. This was the axis of evil period, remember? We don't negotiate with evil, we defeat it, is how Dick Cheney put it. But then the North Koreans went home, woodshedded for a few months, and in October 2006, boom! North Korea detonated its first atomic bomb. George W. Bush turned away from the neocons and handed North Korean diplomacy over to Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice and Assistant Secretary Christopher Hill. They reached out to the North Koreans and tried to restart negotiations. Trouble is, the North Koreans wanted their $25 million out of BDA as a U.S. show of good faith. In February 2007, Rice and Hill agreed, but for an agonizing 100 days were unable to get the money back. Return was determinedly resisted by North Korea hawks in the Bush administration trying to sabotage the resumption of U.S. DPRK negotiations. It appears Treasury privately put out the word that any bank that handled the BDA funds would be regarded as tainted and vulnerable to Patriot Act 311 proceedings itself. We know Treasury refused to provide a waiver to any bank to handle the funds. So, even as Condoleezza Rice publicly and privately approached U.S. banks to handle this tiny transfer, they refused. Ed Royce, the king of the Korea hawks in Congress, suggested that State Department officials themselves might be liable to money laundering charges if they kept trying to arrange the return of the money. Treasury further claimed that the Patriot Act 311 ruling could not be withdrawn, which was patently untrue. Finally, the State Department managed to arrange the return via an unorthodox channel, the only bank in America not subject to Treasury regulation and sanctions, the U.S. Federal Reserve. The supposedly risk-free cratering of a tiny bank in Macau turned out to have a lot of collateral damage. First of all, the Patriot Act 311 mechanism was pretty well discredited. The Treasury Department hadn't even bothered to gin up a credible case against BDA. It claimed BDA was passing North Korean counterfeit $100 bills, but then it turned out that BDA sent all its cash deposits to HSBC Bank in Hong Kong for vetting before deposit. Second, it became clear that the BDA designation had not been part of any sanctions strategy, it was part of an undeclared regime change strategy. Today, when North Korea and China brush aside U.S. assertions that they have responsibility to solve the Korean mess, they're probably thinking about U.S. blundering and bad faith on BDA. Third, there was the embarrassment of the Treasury Department determinedly sabotaging the stated wishes of the President and the State Department. It's a red flag that the assurances of U.S. diplomats on North Korean policy can't be relied upon. Fourth, of course, was that atomic bomb thing. The U.S. and North Korea returned to their negotiations after a 9-month break, with the only difference that now the DPRK had a demonstrated nuclear weapons capability as a bargaining chip. Treasury apologists try to put lipstick on this pig by claiming Treasury stubbornness on the BDA money forced North Korea back to the negotiating table, but it's simply not true. Talks stopped when the money was frozen and didn't resume until the U.S. agreed to give the money back. One reason that there was never a public reckoning on BDA is because financial sanctions are simply too powerful and seductive a weapon to ignore. Outside of Defense Secretary Robert Gates, the highest U.S. official to keep his post when Barack Obama entered office was the Treasury Department's Stuart Levy, the very man who had presided over the BDA fiasco. The Obama administration subsequently refined the financial sanctions weapon against Iran by linking it to legislation and making implementation a matter of presidential discretion and control instead of using the discredited and runaway Patriot Act 311 mechanism. And in every use of secondary sanctions there is the China factor. BDA was targeted because its owner was politically connected in China. In the words of the BDA actions architect, David Asher, the BDA designation was a case of killing the chicken to scare the monkey. In other words, threatening China that if it didn't pressure North Korea, the next target would be a bank it really cared about, like Bank of China. The U.S., in other words, would no longer preserve the integrity of the global financial system. Instead, it would weaponize it against its adversaries. Thus alerted, China has spent the last 10 years busily constructing a parallel global financial network based on an internationalized Chinese currency so that it is in better shape to withstand U.S. financial blackmail. So, the BDA fiasco doesn't just hang over the Korean peninsula, it shadows China and the whole world. Thanks for watching and for being part of the Newsbud community.